Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Irishman from 2019. The Irishman is, or The Irishman, I should enunciate on this because I think I certainly thought, and I think other people did as well, either based on pronunciation or just not reading, that it was the Irishmen, M-E-N plural, but it's the Irishman, which is actually a reference to the nickname of the main character, who is then a real life person. Anyway, this is a crime mob film from Martin Scorsese, yet another in a long list of crime mob films that he's made. But it is quite different than many of the other ones. I am not going to get into all the reasons why it's different, but suffice to say that over its runtime, which is substantial, I had a bit of a sort of a roller coaster of figuring out exactly what the film is, because it's not just another in a long line, despite appearances. This movie was produced for Netflix. It shocks me that it did not get a wider theatrical release as well, because I'm sure it would have performed extremely well. And apparently it was not inexpensive for them to make. And it's pretty extraordinary. So we've talked about crime and mob films and things like that a number of times throughout the course of this series. We haven't talked so much directly about Scorsese. We've talked about him indirectly in movies that he's directed in relation to other things. But I have somewhat mixed feelings on Scorsese. I really appreciate a lot of what he does as a filmmaker. I think he's a very talented director. He selects his projects reasonably carefully, and has a pretty consistent track record. However, for all of the movies that I've seen of his, I'm usually a little bit more moderate on some of them than the people who really herald him as one of the greatest of all time or something like that. And there's no denying that he is certainly one of the best filmmakers of the 20th and 21st century, but he's not without his issues. This seems like the proper time to mention that this film, if you're not already aware, is 3.5 hours long. Which is probably part of the reason why it didn't get wider distribution in theaters, along with being on Netflix. And one of my historical problems with Scorsese is that it often seems like he doesn't know where to cut material, where he is too involved in what he's making to be willing to sacrifice part of his artistic vision, even if it would make for a tighter film. That has always been my attitude towards Goodfellas in particular, as a film that I like quite a lot, but ultimately always feels too long. This movie does not feel too long. And I feel weird even saying that, because it's very long. But the only reason I noticed it was as long as it was, I mean, I already knew, but the only reason I really actively noticed it was because I was trying to schedule other things at the same time around it. And so realizing how much time had passed, dedicating myself to watching it was the main indicator. this film does not have the same pacing as a lot of Scorsese's prior work. A lot of Scorsese's work, especially in his mob films, has a certain sort of rhythm to it that's pretty quick. Even when those films are long, they feel fast in terms of the tempo. They may still seem to drag, but Goodfellas is still a pretty fast-paced film in terms of its overall progression. This film does not feel like that for the most part, and I think that is to its credit. It does feel like a very weird thing to say that the longest film with the slowest pace feels like it's not. It feels like not the shortest, but feels shorter than some of the others. That doesn't really make sense, but such is the nature of cinema. There's so much nuance that can be unpacked about how a film feels in terms of its pacing, but ultimately, so many of the others feel like they're a little bit too rushed, like they're trying to get everything they can in, where this one really feels like it appreciates the time it's taking and it's being extremely deliberate. And I won't deny that in the back of my mind, while watching it, I was thinking this movie is 3.5 hours long, and noticing certain moments in the film where I went, could this be cut? Or could this be shortened or tightened up? And while initially I thought I had a few cases where that was the case, having finished it, I now no longer agree with my assessments at the time. It's not without places that you could probably make some cuts, but I would be hard-pressed to identify individual scenes or elements that should be cut, which is not something I can say about some of the others. Goodfellas, Casino, Gangs of New York, The Departed, The Wolf of Wall Street, all have scenes I think could be cut to tighten them up. That may still be the case with this. I imagine I will end up rewatching this just like I've rewatched the other ones. But I am harder pressed to find individual cases where it could or should be cut. Now, as for why my attitude towards that changed over the course by the end of the film, and that I rescinded my feelings on some of those things, it has to do with what this film is about. And while it is ultimately, on the surface, very much still in the vein of typical Scorsese mob films, looking at individual characters and how they fit into a mob world. This also doesn't suffer from some of my character concerns about some of those other films as well. Scorsese loves to make ensemble casts that have a variety of different major characters. And while usually his films have an individual who you would ultimately call the main character, the singular main character, more often than not, I feel like that the arc of that character can be buried by some of the stories he wants to tell about other people. So even when your main character is in the room, it can feel like the narrative is not following that character. And that can be somewhat disassociative structurally, because you go, well, the character is here, but the camera isn't telling me that they're the main character. And sometimes that can be deliberate, Your main character doesn't have to be the key figure in all events that go on in their lives. But like I said, often I feel like there are scenes in Scorsese's films where it just the character seems almost alienated from the goings on in a scene or even an arc. That is not the case here, and I changed my opinion on it as it went on. There are a number of scenes where the main character does not have a major role to play. In fact, I would say maybe not a majority, but probably more scenes than I can think of, a higher percentage of scenes than in a lot of Scorsese's other work. However, that's kind of the point. And I don't want to delve into this too much. Not because I think I could spoil this film too much. A lot of this film is about what you interpret from below the surface level of the storytelling, and that's something I really, really appreciate. But so much of the character development and the tone and the understanding of individuals and groups is sort of emergent from the way the story is told, where the primary character may not hold the primary role in a scene or even a major role, but by virtue of the way scenes are structured, their presence is so important to the overarching story that by the end, they really wrap everything together in a way that makes you deeply appreciate seeing scenes that may not have felt as relevant or as poignant or as emotionally meaningful at the time they were told, but in the overall course of the film, punch a little harder. So it's not that it undermines typical tropes of mob films, or even that it particularly undermines Scorsese's own work. But it is somewhat, I hesitate to say critical, but it is contemplative, I think, of Scorsese's own previous work, of taking a somewhat different view of the mob life, of the individuals who are in this world. And while clearly, tonally, this is much less about the flash and glamour and the rise and fall of, organized crime and organized criminals, and people in those enterprises, it still tells a really meaningful mob story in a way that I think tells character better than almost anything else he's made. To that end, the casting is, as usual for Scorsese, pretty excellent. A lot of the old guys who have been around, who have been in prior films with him and for him, are, some of them came out of retirement. So De Niro playing the main character is possibly at the best I've ever seen him in anything. And he plays a character that is very sort of low-key throughout. And that's why I'm going to give him so much credit for his acting, is that there's so much told about his character in small actions or even the absence of actions. The way he holds himself, the look on his face, the small expressions that he makes, to really color how he fits in as a puzzle piece to the rest of the story. Likewise, I would say there's a bunch of guys in here who I normally don't love. I don't love De Niro. I don't love Al Pacino. I don't love Joe Pesci all the time, especially. Actually, I think some of Joe Pesci's worst work is with Scorsese, but they all come back in some of the finest form I think I've ever seen them in. And part of that has to do with how more realistic, less flashy the characters are, but also has to do with how the story is told in this longer scope of the story from a younger group of guys to a much older group of guys. And I don't want to, there's so many characters in here of varying minor levels, and they're pretty much all great. Ray Romano's in here. He does a great job. Harvey Keitel is very minor, but does a great job. There's a couple of people that I recognize that are not typical actors, but I even thought they did a pretty good job. So Action Bronson is in here for a scene. He does just fine. And I'm going to probably butcher his name. Sebastian Maniscalco, or hold on. Maniscalco, I think. He's a comedian. And like, he's not doing a great, he's not doing an incredible, award-winning job or anything, but he does a good job. He fits the roles, and the casting is great, and everybody's dressed the part. And that is a credit to the actors. It's a credit to the dialogue and the script that was delivered. It's a credit to the directorship. But there's also so much really well done structurally because of the course of this film being over the basically 60 years, more than that, possibly. And a lot of that element is done really well as well. In terms of the cinematography, I really appreciate some of the notes that were taken in terms of making different eras look different. And it's not, that could easily be done very badly, where it's like, oh, the 80s are this color or whatever, but it's much more subtle than that. And it is it's very calculated in terms of using, I think what they were attempting to do was basically film different eras with the sort of the film qualities that would have been appropriate or would have been contemporary to the time. And I think it works really well. Likewise, the transitions for those sorts of things, because it's not just a chronological thing. It jumps back and forth quite a lot. And the jumps could easily be very abrupt and bad and ugly and unpleasant and, take you out of the story, but they don't. Which is credit both to the, how the script was structured, but also to the editing. There's a lot of really good editing that eases you from one era into the other without being disruptive, but also without, you getting lost and not realizing that things have transitioned. The one thing that is pretty iffy in some cases is the de-aging and aging process, which my understanding is a lot of it was digital and then some of it was makeup. Obviously, a bunch of these guys are pretty old. I think De Niro and Pesci and Pacino are all well into their 70s, if not 80s at this point. And, having them play guys in their 30s and 40s is never going to be an easy thing. Whether you do it with, one, how they hold themselves is going to be difficult. How they deliver their, you have to deliver deliver stuff like you're a certain age. People of a certain age just behave differently. And so it's a credit to the actors there. Some of the de-aging is slightly iffy. Some of it, it's just not quite believable that they're as young as they're supposed to be. You're like, okay, this is a 70-something-year-old man playing a 30-something-year-old man who looks like he's maybe in his 40s or 50s. And it's not that I want them necessarily to like go harder on the de-aging, because it's still sort of it's not quite there in terms of the perfecting that technology. But it's usually not super jarring. It's just, it's the one thing that stands out as not transitioning super well from one era to another. If you're, if everything else is working, but they don't look like they've changed age quite enough, it can be a little bit not quite right. But other than that, I think it's pretty good. I think some people had some pretty critical things to say about it when it first came out. I didn't think any of it was really egregious, and that is something I'm generally pretty critical of. But it worked well enough, and the old age makeup they put on De Niro at the as a sort of narrative effect, and towards some of the ending stuff is, I think, done very well. I think that was probably all makeup. It was all practical because, he's already pretty old. They don't have to age him up that much. So, credit where it's due there. The sets and costumes are all like appropriate. Again, they're not nearly as flashy as a lot of prior Scorsese mob films, and I think that's to their credit. It is a little bit, something you have to keep in the back of your mind, or try not to even, is that I did have some preconceived notions, and I think most people who have seen anything else in this vein will have some preconceived notions of what to expect from a Scorsese crime film. And so to have it not be quite as flashy is not something I want to say is a flaw in it, because it's not. It's still done extremely well. It's just a bit more subtle. And again, it's a little bit, reflective of upon his prior works. To say, maybe the all the pomp that used to be there was not quite appropriate, or a little bit too celebratory. And that's not to say, this movie strikes a balance. It's not failing to still, in some ways, paint more pleasant pictures of guys who were less pleasant. It's still doing that, but it's doing it with a lot more shades of darker gray. And that ultimately gets to possibly my favorite thing about the whole film, which is how it culminates, not in terms of a climax, but almost an anticlimax. And the story that it ends up ultimately trying to tell in terms of its tone and where you see the focus come to by the end, which is that this is really much more of a study of a single character and all of the experiences that he's had and all of the things that he got into and how he felt about them and how they affected his life, whether he wanted them to or not. The ramifications of a life of working for a crime family are not. They don't just end in violence and or tragedy and or comeuppance like so many others in this air quotes genre. It is much more. It's much more subtle. in terms of the story it's telling. And again, big credit to De Niro for being able to portray a character with a nuance that is somewhat untold. You know, I suppose this is a minor emotional spoiler in terms of how I felt about the film, but if you don't want that, you can skip the next 30 seconds. I felt pretty deeply sad at the end of the film. Sad for and about the main character. He's got so much that has gone on for him, and reflecting on his life in the way that the movie manages to do is so well done that trying to sort of divorce those feelings from the actions of the character and the things that happened and the choices that were made can be difficult, especially and it's especially troubling sort of mentally to feel that way about a character who, even more than some of these previous films, it seems darker. And yet I think he's possibly the most sympathetic of any of Scorsese's characters in this genre. I was just kind of blown away by it. I just really appreciated that, and I'm not sure it will necessarily hit me the same the next time I watch it, but I'm curious. I think it's the thing that makes this go from another Scorsese crime film to me to something kind of exceptional. I'm not necessarily going to say it's his best film. Certainly not until I've had more time to reflect on it and see it again. But it's certainly up there, and it's not without its flaws. But I really appreciate the difference. Now, Scorsese as a person, there's plenty of criticisms I would make about him as a person and his influence on the American cinema over the last, what is it, 60, no, more than 60 years? No, not quite 60 years. I don't know. He's been around a long time, and he's a bit of an old stick in the mud. He's an old man, but there's no denying he's made some excellent stuff, and this is definitely no exception. I think it is worth noting that this is apparently based on a book, basically a nonfiction book in theory. But one of the things that made me come around to watching this, and remembering that I had intended to watch it, was listening to an interview with Michael Franzese, or I don't know how to pronounce his last name, the former capo of the Colombo crime family, basically saying, not outright, but basically saying he knows what actually happened, and this didn't get it right. And that does get to one sort of final element about the story here, which is this is a story largely about Jimmy Hoffa, who is a major character in American history, but one who I knew almost nothing about. Jimmy, prior to this, I knew almost nothing about him. That he's a name that gets thrown around in the same way as like Elvis, in terms of semi conspiracy theories about like what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa, and to be perfectly honest, I thought Jimmy Hoffa was another guy in the entertainment industry. There were a lot of guys in entertainment who got, entangled with the mob in various ways, for better or for worse. I didn't realize who he actually was. So this actually has some fascinating connections to things we were talking about in the trial of the Chicago Seven, and the sort of the legacy of political corruption and big business and organized crime getting into politics and keeping people in power and out of power, and how people outside of indirectly in the political realm, like Jimmy Hoffa, learning that story, and which was not one I was really that aware of, is fascinating in its own right. Of course, I take all of the storytelling in this film with a substantial pinch of salt, but nonetheless, it's a fascinating thing that I don't really think has gotten a lot of the same exploration as things like the mob in general, or that certain, like the politics and era of the cultural and social ramifications of politics in the 60s and 70s, and there's so much to explore, and I think this film does a really good job of tying in all of these disparate elements in a way that tells a pretty complete story without getting overly detailed, while also, being intriguing in its own right. I, again, barely knew about Jimmy Hoffa, and I don't really have any deep interest in, like, finding out the mystery of Jimmy Hoffa, but it is an interesting thing to know more about now and to see touched on in a cinematic sphere. I think that covers most of my thoughts and feelings on the film. I really enjoyed it. I think it's a very worthy addition. I know that it was somewhat polarizing on its release, but I think it's a worthy watch. Oh, one more thing I'm just going to throw in there, is it gave me certain shades of memories, comparing it to one particular film that one person, possibly only one person, will care about, and that's About Schmidt. And I know that's a weird call out, but there's enough connective tissue there that I think it's a meaningful reference to make. So anyway, just throwing that out there. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.